Now, in our own prehistory of the planet Earth, we have myths from all over the world about an amphibious race of people who helped begin civilization. There are legends of the Naga, who are amphibious beings from a lost city under the sea that came to bring civilization and fire and technology to humans from India all the way to South China. In George.R.R. Martin's universe, the Naga was a sea dragon that the Grey King who founded the Iron Islands slew in the Age of Heroes. In his book, Eden in the East, Stephen Oppenheimer cites ancient texts of the Mesopotamians in which amphibious teachers come from sunken Southeast Asia or Sundaland, bringing new technology to the people there, and so, in a way, created one of our earliest civilizations anywhere. In fact, there are legends of these advanced amphibious peoples visiting early civilizations, mostly around 5,500 years ago, all over the world. In Irish mythology, they're the Fomorians and sometimes the Sea Peoples. In Southeastern American myth, among the Native Americans, you have the legends of the Water People. According to Oppenheimer, all the cultures around this time that were influenced by these sea peoples share in common certain artifacts, such as a certain type of net sinker used in boats, poisons used from fish, and also a certain type of carved human statuette that shows up not only during the Ubaid period and in Ur, but also on the northern coast of Australia, still in existence in New Guinea, and also Korea and Japan. Paul Kekai Manansala has also added to this suite of cultural similarities the practice of skull binding or artificial cranial deformation. And in some of my later videos on prehistoric fiction or fantasy, I'll be adding to that suite of cultural similarities a high preponderance of Microcephalin D and also Y haplogroups L and T. But to suffice it to say that there seems to be a heavy influence of a people who are highly advanced and very good at seafaring, who influenced a lot of coastal cultures right at the last great glacial melting point, when Sundaland was consumed by the sea. And Sundaland exists still today in the islands of Southeast Asia, Indonesia. With the exception of Stephen Oppenheimer and some others, mainstream science doesn't really like to address this issue and these similarities. And that, I think, is kind of irresponsible because it leads to wild speculation and irresponsible journalism, such as you see on some of the Discovery Channel shows and the History Channel shows. But this is due to the scientific community's failure to give us an adequate reason why all these cultures along the coast 5,500 years ago had such similar traits and took up practices that seem to have no practical reason, irregardless, such as artificial cranial deformation. The scientists refuse to admit there's even a problem, so you get ancient alien theories, you get creation theories, you get the universe is a virtual reality theories, and flat earth theories, and hollow earth theories, and everything else you can think of. And it's not the public's fault. it's the scientific community's fault because they're afraid to theorize. Science fiction and fantasy also play a role in this theorizing because, in a lot of ways, providing any kind of explanation for these similarities and so-called coincidences is taboo. You also have the aquatic ape theory, which provides an explanation of how Homo sapiens sapiens lost their hair, or hominids in general lost their hair, if they did, by postulating a waterside existence scenario. In the early days of aquatic ape theory, it was kind of mermaidish. People thought that there were some theorists that believed that some kind of a primate must have spent almost its entire life in the water and developed an almost merman-like existence. But this theory has evolved, and now they believe more in a waterside existence. We have a layer of fat, kind of like the cetaceans, and we also are hairless like cetaceans, and these are two of the prime arguments they have for this theory, but there are others. But what if only one of the various species of Homo was aquatic, and the rest of them were, like the Australopithecines, hairy and bipedal, living on land? If you put the aquatic ape theory together with the musings of Stan Gooch and Stephen Oppenheimer, you might get something that looks a lot like the deep ones in A Song of Ice and Fire. According to Oppenheimer, Sundaland was most advanced of all the continents and lands in the world circa 10,000 BC. As it sank, their trading culture, which was called the New Santeo trading culture, expanded to different coastal localities all over China, up and down India, and even into the river systems that led into the Levant and eventually into Europe. They're the megalithic culture, and you find some of the earliest megaliths in Southeast Asia and Polynesia, where they are said to have spread. And wherever you find these concentrations of LT haplogroups of Y up and down the river systems of Europe, you also find megaliths. In all these areas, you also find high concentrations of Microcephalin D. The sea Dyaks and sea gypsies of Southeast Asia still have a culture very much like this early New Santeo culture, with the stilt houses and the same uses of the sinker nets. And their religion, in a lot of ways, seems to be a precursor of both the Vedic religions and the Indo-European religions, the pantheons of 7 gods. And all of these religions have a flood myth. These people are also most able to hold their breath underwater. They can hold their breath underwater longer than anybody else on the planet. And they purposely bust out their children's eardrums at an early age by bringing them underwater so that they won't feel these effects later and will be able to go down to high depths. This is reality. This isn't Westeros. This is our own place. Now, according to Stan Gooch, the elder religion of the Neanderthals and the hunter-gatherers who were influenced by the Neanderthals was a religion of 13. And usually most of the eldest of the megaliths are actually with 12 stones, and the central one would be the person, the priest, or the shaman. He believes that they were first used trees before they used these megalithic stones. The later megaliths that the New Santeo culture brings, sometimes 12, but you see more divisions of 7. Well, the New Santeo culture needed to use the 7-star constellation in order to navigate. The reason that the Neanderthals used 13s was because this is how you would calculate a year if you were going by a month, if you were going by the moon. Hunter-gatherers don't need to be as precise, and so they don't have to make up all this mathematics for leap year and everything. They use a moon calendar, and that way they're more in tune with the natural timing of the universe than the artificial sun calendar, which may not be as true to the workings of the universe and the way time works in the universe, but it is far more pragmatic and useful for calculating when you're going to plant crops. George R. R. Martin's use of 13 is very subtle, but you see it, and it's always associated with the old gods, the first men, or the prehistoric societies. So I think he's been reading some Stan Gooch. 13th commander of the Night's Watch was a Night's King. The last hero in the long night set out with 13, and only he survived. 13 is also the number of people you need for a witch's coven, King Arthur's court, the Last Supper, whereas 7 is more of a religion based on navigation and the sun. So what you have here is this hunter-gatherer Neanderthal society being taken over by this new, more unnatural, sun-worshipping society. And we're going to find many parallels with our own world and Westeros that have to do with these two numbers and the worship of either the moon or the sun, ice or fire. The Lion of Night and the Maiden made of Light, R'hllor and the Great Other, Neanderthal versus man, fairy versus man, matriarchy versus patriarchy, socialism versus capitalism, yin versus yang. Now, I've mentioned Microcephalin D before. Everywhere you see the signs of this New Santeo culture in our own ancient world circa 5,500 BC, or 5,500 years ago, you also see Microcephalin D. Now, we don't really know what this gene is for, but some scientists have postulated that it helps with regrowing brain tissue in intense heat where sunlight is really high, and other scientists have postulated that it has something to do with our linguistics. Places that have a high rate of Microcephalin D have a lot of non-tonal languages, and the only societies in the world that don't have a high preponderance of Microcephalin D are in Africa and China, where tonal languages are more prevalent. It's been a popular idea that the Neanderthals have been a sing-songy race, moon worshippers who probably used a tonal language. And there have been several references to the magic of the children of the forest somewhat being accomplished by song. But Microcephalin D didn't evolve in Homo sapiens sapiens, even though 70% of the world's population has it, and it was spread over our entire species in a relatively short time over the course of 30,000 years or less. In other words, it was introduced to the species Homo sapiens sapiens sometime around 27,000 to 30,000 years ago. And it was sexually selected so heavily that now 70% of the Earth's population have it. But Microcephalin D didn't come from any known hominid that lived 30,000 years ago. It probably didn't come from Neanderthals because none of the Neanderthal samples that we've taken have Microcephalin D. It didn't come from the Denisovans because none of the samples of the Denisovans we've taken have microcephalin D. So if it arose in Neanderthal or Denisovan and made a similar sweep of their genome, similar to the one it made of our own species, it must have happened in an isolated subspecies, if you will, from Neanderthal or Denisovan. The species that evolved microcephalin D broke off from all of the other lineages of Homo sapiens about 1 million years ago, before the split between Neanderthals and the latest split of Denisovans. And it remained isolated from the lineage that led to Homo sapiens sapiens for the next almost 100,000 years, until about 30,000 years ago, when the humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, assimilated another subspecies of hominid, and the only thing they seem to have kept from that genome is microcephalin D. Now, there are three parts of the Denisovan genome, and I believe they point to three separate hominid species that joined together and became one hybrid species before man in turn assimilated it. But that's too much for the scope of this video. I'll get to that in another video unrelated to A Song of Ice and Fire. Whether the microcephalin D hominid was a separate species from Neanderthal and Denisovan, or a part of one of the three species that made up Denisovan that developed the microcephalin D genome, is really irrelevant. What we really know, and what's really important to this conversation, is that we assimilated a subspecies of hominid, or Homo, which had evolved separately from most, if not all, of the other subspecies of hominids, such as Neanderthal and Denisovan, for nearly 1 million years, and that the culture that assimilated that subspecies somehow benefited from this gene, microcephalin D, and became what many cultures all over the world call the sea peoples or the water peoples, who in myth are said to be at least somewhat amphibious, have high technology, and have great command of the waterways. Now, there have been ancient alien theorists who have tried to use microcephalin D as evidence of interbreeding with aliens. Well, since we know that microcephalin D split off from the normal form of microcephalin 1 million years ago and then remained isolated in a subspecies until 30,000 years ago, that isn't too likely, unless you're saying that the aliens took a hominid up into space and then delivered him back down 30,000 years ago to breed with people. But looking at it from the aquatic ape idea, what if the reason we don't find any fossils of the subspecies of hominid that developed microcephalin D is because they were always living in the water, just like the sea Dyaks and the sea gypsies of Southeast Asia do today. They spend nearly their whole lives in the water, stilt houses and boats. They had dolichocephalic skulls because they were Homo erectus. And then you see one of the common traits of the New Santeo culture being emulating these elongated skulls, trying to be more like their ancestors. In fact, some of these sites that are associated with the New Santeo culture, like Cow Swamp in Australia, may not even be the result of artificial cranial deformation. They may naturally be that way. There have been sites in the Paracas in South America which may show the same thing, and even a few sites in Russia. Of course, near waterways where the first civilizations began. Homo erectus soloensis may have lived up to 27,000 years ago in Southeast Asia, and I probably would say that he lived there a lot longer. You've got the hobbits of Flores Islands, which may have existed also that long, and you've even got the Paleo hominids, who are only like 3,000, 3,500 years old, that lived in Indonesia as well. And these have always kind of struck me as these kind of brownie or elf people who use spears, probably poison. And I picture them a lot like George R. Martin describes the Cranogmen. Frog hunters with spears, real stealthy, and they know how to hide to keep away from men. But I think it's very possible that the union of these technologies, this Homo erectus soloensis technology, with the early explorers in Indonesia, may have sparked the Paleolithic Revolution and then later the Agricultural Revolution. Since then, their genes have spread to every population of people in the entire planet, this new Santeo people. Even the places I've spoken about before in Africa and China who don't have a high prevalence of microcephalin D do have some amount of microcephalin D in their population. And I think it's important to note that microcephalin D doesn't seem to convey any type of intelligence to a person who has it. Some of the most intelligent people who ever lived do not have microcephalin D, such as Albert Einstein and Nelson Mandela. They were both of the haplogroup E clade, and which means instead of microcephalin D, they have the YAP mutation, which I believe is a more Neanderthal mutation, and which scientists have equated with tonal languages. It may be that microcephaline's benefit is that it helps to regrow brain tissue faster in hot environments, and it helps you to better comprehend non-tonal languages and the subtleties of that language. After the Ice Age, it got hotter again, so this might be more beneficial because of that. And because the New Santeo trade network was so large and expansive, it would be a benefit to be able to speak their language very well, except in the places that resisted it. But before I get off on a tangent, let's suffice it to say that in both our own world and in the world of Westeros, there is this ancient legend that seems to be nearly global of a amphibious race. And whether amphibious means that they truly could breathe underwater or whether they were just good with boats is yet to be seen. But Homo erectus soloensis was probably the most advanced Homo erectus that ever lived. Their tools were very advanced and their brains were very big for Homo erectus. My own opinion is that they lived in Sundaland and that they learned to operate boats very early, and they did have probably a waterside existence, but of course I don't think they spent their lives swimming around in the water like mermaids. However, there are those who believe in a scenario very much like that, these type of Dogon Naga or frog people or amphibious magi who were actually more aquatic than just living on stilt houses and houseboats. And some people even believe that they had gills. I think that A Song of Ice and Fire goes with that theory, that these brothers to mankind who were amphibious could actually breathe underwater. Whether that's George Martin's real opinion or not, it may just be his speculation or his daydream. But putting this all together with George.R.R. Martin's works and the works of one of his biggest influences, H.P. Lovecraft, can bring us to some very important insights into A Song of Ice and Fire. According to Wikipedia, the Deep Ones are creatures in the Cthulhu mythos of H.P. Lovecraft. The beings first appeared in Lovecraft's novella The Shadow over Innsmouth, but were already hinted at in the earlier short story Dagon. The Deep Ones are a race of intelligent, ocean-dwelling creatures, approximately human-shaped, but with a fishy, froggy appearance. They regularly mate with humans along the coast, creating societies of hybrids. Numerous mythos elements are associated with the Deep Ones, including the legendary town of Innsmouth, the undersea city of Yana Nithli, the esoteric order of Dagon, and the beings known as Father Dagon and Mother Hydra. After their debut in Lovecraft's tale, the sea-dwelling creatures resurfaced in the works of other authors, especially August Derleth. I'd like to also add Robert E. Howard and George.R.R. Martin, among others, to that. It goes on to say, Lovecraft provides a description of the Deep Ones in The Shadow over Innsmouth. I think their predominant color was a grayish green. Though they had white bellies, they were mostly shiny and slippery, but the ridges of their backs were scaly. Their forms vaguely suggested the anthropod, while their heads were the heads of fish, with prodigious bulging eyes that never closed. At the sides of their necks were palpitating gills, and their long paws were webbed. They hopped irregularly, sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4. I was somehow glad that they had no more than 4 limbs. Their croaking, baying voices, clearly used for articulate speech, held all the dark shades of expression which their staring faces lacked. They were the blasphemous fish frogs of the nameless design, living and horrible. Lovecraft describes the Deep Ones as a race of undersea-dwelling humanoids whose preferred habitat is deep in the ocean, hence their name. However, despite being primarily marine creatures, they can come to the surface and can survive on land for extended periods of time. All Deep Ones are immortal, none die except by accident or violence. They are said to serve the beings known as Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, as well as Cthulhu. They are opposed by mysterious beings known as the Old Gods, whose powerful magic can keep them in check. This detail is one of the vestigial hints that August Derleth developed as the most unnamed elder gods. The backstory of The Shadow over Innsmouth involves a bargain between Deep Ones and humans in which the aquatic species provides plentiful fishing and gold in the form of strangely formed jewelry. In return, the land dwellers give human sacrifice and a promise of mixing, the mating of humans with Deep Ones. Although the Deep One hybrid offspring are both born with the appearance of a normal human being, the individual will eventually transform into a Deep One, gaining immortality by default only when the transformation is complete. The transformation usually occurs when the individual reaches middle age. As the hybrid gets older, he or she begins to acquire the so-called Innsmouth look, as he or she takes on more and more attributes of the Deep One race. The ears shrink, the eyes bulge and become unblinking, the head narrows and gradually goes bald, the skin becomes scabrous as it changes into scales, and the neck develops folds which later become gills. When the hybrid becomes too obviously non-human and is hidden away from outsiders, eventually, however, the hybrid will be compelled to slip into the sea to live with the Deep Ones in one of their undersea cities. This description of Lovecraft's Deep Ones and his Deep One hybrid humans reminds me a lot of those descriptions we just heard of the Crannog Men and the Squishers and the Merfolk from A Song of Ice and Fire. And this disease that they have that turns you into a Deep One seems a whole lot like grayscale. Next Thursday, we'll go more in depth about the connection between Lovecraft's hybrid disease and grayscale, so please subscribe by clicking the link right here. On this page,
you'll find our channel and links to this week's other uploads, including a prediction breakdown for the grand finale of Season 6 and a trip with archaeologist Richard Hodges and I to a Native American dig site in search of ancient giants and the original set of roots. So please subscribe. Come back next week. We got lots more to share with you.